Welcome to the CST Flight Services video series. I'm Rick Gardner, and in this video, we're going to cover regulations and procedures for planning and executing a flight to Mexico, where the CST Flight Services Operations Center is based. In addition to this video, we strongly recommend that you also watch our video on documents and equipment for international flight, as well as our video on U.S. regulations and procedures for departing and arriving in the U.S. Let's take a look at what weather you can expect when traveling to Mexico. Mexico is a very large country, and weather patterns and conditions can vary greatly depending where you are in the country. So you should become familiar with the specific weather patterns for the regions in Mexico that you plan to visit. Mexico has three completely different coastlines: the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea, and the Pacific Ocean, each one with its own unique qualities. All three, however, are at risk for hurricane activity. So during the hurricane season, you should always keep an eye on the National Hurricane Center website. The rainy season in Mexico is usually from May to October. Thunderstorms usually occur during the afternoon and evening, although in some areas, like the Yucatan Peninsula, they can occur throughout the day. Note that Mexico also has a lot of terrain, and that terrain can provoke extreme weather. So as a general rule, we try to be on the ground by the early afternoon during the rainy season. The CST member website contains a wide variety of sources for international weather. While CST does not produce the international weather information, we have identified a number of resources that do. So we have organized links to these resources in a way that pilots will find familiar. There are a number of different options for aeronautical charts for flying to Mexico. The FAA sectional charts no longer provide aeronautical information or details for traveling to Mexico. The FAA does publish IFR en route charts that do cover all of Mexico, although even in those the data has been reduced somewhat, but they can be downloaded for free from the CST member website. The Mexican government publishes their own World Aeronautical Charts, better known as WAC charts, that cover all of Mexico, and these can also be downloaded for free from the CST member website. There are also VFR terminal charts published by the Mexican government for the main airports in Mexico, and those too can be downloaded for free from the CST member website. At one time, the Department of Defense in the U.S. published charts called the Operational Navigation Charts, or ONC. They're long gone, but they can still provide some useful information for topography, and those can also be downloaded for free from the CST member website. When planning your route to Mexico, there are several things that you need to consider. First, as with most countries, air traffic in Mexico charges for airspace fees and ATC overtime. However, unlike other countries, Mexico has an extremely complicated process for calculating and paying ATC, airspace, and overtime fees. If you have any doubts whatsoever, contact CST and we can provide you with instructions for free on how you can determine if you owe Mexico any fees. And if you find out that you do, you can pay them online through the CST main website or by contacting us here at CST. CST members will get special pricing. When planning a flight to Mexico, it is very important to take into consideration terrain. Most of Mexico is mountainous, and much of this terrain can be very remote, with dormant and active volcanoes that exceed 16,000 feet MSL. So if you're in a light general aviation aircraft, it's best to plan a route that minimizes your exposure to that terrain. You should also consider your aircraft performance at high density altitudes. When traveling to Baja, consider departing from Southern California or southwestern Arizona and staying on either the western or eastern coastlines of the peninsula, as there is a lot of terrain that runs down the center of the peninsula. If you plan to depart from the west coast of the U.S. and travel down to southern Mexico, you may want to consider remaining over the shoreline as long as possible before turning inland. If you are coming from the central US, you may want to consider departing Brownsville, Texas, and flying down the shoreline of the Gulf of Mexico. If the Yucatan Peninsula is your destination, you can also fly from Key West over to Cancun. However, this route will expose you to about 400 nautical miles of open water. For aircraft that have the capability and can comply with the navigation and communication requirements, you can also fly over the Gulf of Mexico into the northern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. However, that will also expose you to considerable overwater flying. If you need to transition from the Pacific coastline over to the Gulf of Mexico or vice versa, the Ixtepec Pass is a convenient route with a wide pass through the mountains. If you are planning to enter Mexico and you departed from anywhere other than the US or Canada, then you should plan to make your very first landing in either Tapachula, Mexico on the Pacific coast or in Cozumel on the Caribbean coast. So therefore, if you are planning to enter from the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, you should determine which one of these two airports best suits your route when considering your final destination in Mexico. Next, you need to consider what airspace you will be flying through on your way to Mexico. Mexico will not charge you airspace fees if your flight begins or ends at an airport in Mexico. These airspace fees are automatically charged when you fuel in Mexico. And if you don't fuel, nothing happens. If your route takes you through COSESNA or CENAMER, Central American airspace, and your max takeoff weight is below 12,500 pounds, COSESNA will also not charge you any airspace fees. If your route of flight to Mexico takes you over Belize or Guatemala, then you will need to request overflight permits from those countries depending upon which one or ones you overfly. However, it is important to remind pilots that entering Mexico from other than the US or Canada, you must enter through Tapachula or Cozumel. If your route takes you over territorial Cuba, you will need to get a Cuban overflight permit and pay their airspace fees. While Cuba normally requires an overflight permit to fly in their airspace, there are some routes where this may not be necessary. Now, historically, one of those routes had been Green 765 or Upper Green 765. But today, we are required to obtain a Cuban overflight permit for those airways, and you must fly those airways under IFR. You can obtain a Cuban overflight permit at any time online on the main CST Flight Services website. If you plan to fly around Cuba, VFR, while inside their airspace, then remember that you must remain outside their inner Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. So let's talk about getting there. Mexico requires that your very first landing and your very last takeoff be made at an airport of entry, or AOE, where Mexican Customs, Immigration, Civil Aviation are present. It doesn't have to be the first one you cross, it just needs to be where you make your first landing. It is extremely important, if you plan to enter Mexico from other than the US or Canada, to enter through Tapachula or Cozumel. Another important consideration when planning your route is fuel availability. Always plan enough fuel to fly to your intended destination and still have enough fuel to fly to another destination that has fuel. Fuel in Mexico is measured in liters, not gallons, so be prepared to convert. Any fuel additives that you may require, such as Prist, are typically either extremely difficult to find or extremely expensive when you do find them. So we recommend you bring what you will need with you. In Mexico, 100 LL avgas is known as gas avión, and Jet A is known as turbocina. Mexican airports of entry and fuel prices in Mexico are posted on the CST member website and updated twice a month. Now let's review the actual procedures for flying into, within, and out of Mexico. First, let's cover some regulatory issues. Efforts by CST and other aviation associations to obtain permission for experimental aircraft, as well as pilots with basic med, had been successful. Unfortunately, at the present time, the authorities in Mexico are not recognizing those approvals. And so we strongly urge you to contact the airport or airports where you plan to operate in advance to see if they will honor the documents that the civil aviation authorities of Mexico have published with those two topics. In 2011, CST as well as AOPA petitioned the Mexican civil aviation authorities to clarify the insurance requirements for private Part 91 aircraft. And they responded that for private flights, you can use the insurance policy issued in your country of registry. And it will be valid in Mexico provided that you have at least $300,000 of liability insurance, that the insurance policy covers Mexico, and that you maintain that policy in effect while you are in Mexico. However, if you want to be totally sure, you can also purchase supplemental Mexican liability insurance for your aircraft. There is a link on the CST member website that will take you to a company that sells that. We have no commercial relationship or interest, and we obtain no commercial or financial benefit if you use that link. We only provide it as a courtesy to the CST member website. Regardless of whether you purchase the supplemental Mexican insurance or you use your insurance from your country of registry, you want to be certain that your hull is covered in Mexico. On December 31st of 2013, Mexico implemented their own Advanced Passenger Information System, or APIS, for entering and departing the country. The original regulations required that pilots submit their APIS manifest through airing, through the airing portal, or through a third party with an airing portal. This presented a true complication and financial burden to anyone that wanted to comply with the law. CST petitioned the Mexican immigration authorities, and they approved an alternate procedure to get relief, and pilots of private aircraft can now file their manifest by themselves using an Excel spreadsheet and emailing it to Mexican immigration. The spreadsheet needs to be emailed first within 24 hours and a second time 30 minutes before departing the foreign country for Mexico or departing Mexico for a foreign country. The Mexican policy document, the Excel spreadsheet, and instructions on how to do this can be found on the CST member website. When you enter Mexico, you are restricted to fly only with the passengers and crew that entered with the aircraft. However, you can modify the authorized list of passengers to take other people on board your aircraft by going to the Mexican Civil Aviation authorities at the airport and requesting to update the list. Another method is to send an email to the email address shown. However, there can be great variation on these procedures between airports, so actual results may vary. Pilots are not allowed to bring anything with them other than their personal effects. Pilots are not allowed to bring anything with them into Mexico other than their personal effects. Mexican customs law states that if the pilot can prove that they are the owner of the aircraft, then they have the same rights as a passenger to bring items into the country. One way around this, if you can't, is, well, ask your passengers to bring your other items in for you. Bringing firearms and/or ammunition into Mexico is a very serious offense that could result in long jail terms. Be sure that you do not bring these items into Mexico unless you have received authorization from the appropriate Mexican authorities in advance of your flight. If you are bringing prescription medication, be sure that you have the prescription information with you or on the bottle. Bringing illegal drugs into Mexico is a very serious offense. If you will be traveling with any persons who are not U.S. or Canadian citizens, you should check if their nationalities require a visa from the Mexican government before you make your flight. If you plan to bring a pet with you, make sure you have up-to-date information on the Mexican requirements for bringing a pet into the country to avoid having them detained, quarantined, and hopefully not worse. So now let's review the procedures for flying into Mexico. First, Mexico requires you enter or depart through an AOE. Doesn't have to be the first one you cross, just has to be an AOE. Once you have identified which one you plan to use, then you submit your Mexican APIS before departing the foreign country with the timing that we mentioned earlier. The first APIS manifest 24 hours before, the second 30 minutes before. Next, file your flight plan to that AOE and remember to activate your flight plan once you are airborne. When you cross into Mexico, you are required to contact the ATC facility closest to your point of border or coastline crossing, which could be a tower, approach, or center. You can download our border crossing chart for free from the CST member website. It shows ATC and flight service frequencies on both sides of the border. This chart can help you quickly identify what frequency to use to check in with Mexican ATC. A Mexican tower will automatically close your IFR or VFR flight plans, whichever the case may be. On international arrivals, don't be surprised if you are met on the ramp by soldiers, agents from Mexican Customs, the National Guard, or other federal agencies. They may have drug-sniffing dogs and will want to inspect your aircraft and your bags. Consider this normal. You can download a form from the Mexico page of the CST member website that contains the most commonly asked questions, which have been translated into English and to Spanish so you can complete it in advance to help with the communication. Mexico is in the process of phasing out their immigration forms, so depending upon which airport you land at, you may or may not be asked to complete a Mexican immigration card. If you are asked, they will stamp the form, tear off a stub, and return it to you. Don't lose it. You may have to surrender it on departure. You may be asked to complete a general declaration form. Again, it varies from airport to airport. You can also download those from the CST member website. Next, you may be asked to complete a Mexican Customs declaration form. And after you have presented it, you will be faced with a light that looks like a traffic light with a green and red light with a button. And when you push the button, the light randomly turns either green or it turns red. If it's green, you're good to go. If it turns red, then you are subject to a mandatory inspection of your baggage. Depending on the airport, you may also be asked to complete a cash declaration form. Bringing more than $10,000 in currency or financial instruments into Mexico is not a crime, but failing to report it is a crime. So be sure to accurately complete the form if requested. Once you have completed those procedures, every aircraft that lands in Mexico has got to go through an entry process. The first important document in that process is called the arrival report, which needs to be stamped by Mexican Immigration and Mexican Customs. That form proves that the aircraft passed through those two federal agencies. Then you will go to the Civil Aviation Authority, which we call the AFAC, and they will check that the arrival report has been stamped, and then they will stamp it as well. Don't lose that form because it demonstrates when the aircraft entered the country and that it entered legally. Next, you'll need to obtain an entry permit for that aircraft. This is issued by the AFAC. You will be asked to complete a request form. You'll need to specify whether you want a single entry permit or a multiple entry permit. Regardless of the permit, you will have to bring copies and original of your airworthiness certificate, your registration certificate, your insurance policy, your airman certificate, and medical certificate. A single entry permit is valid for 180 days or until the aircraft departs Mexico. A multiple entry permit is valid for the calendar year and expires on December 31st of that year. During the time that permit is valid, the aircraft can enter Mexico as many times as you wish without having to purchase an additional permit. However, the aircraft can never remain in Mexico for more than 180 days. If you plan to enter Mexico towards the end of the year and you have a multiple entry permit, you may want to consider on that last entry to purchase a single entry permit. That way, if your aircraft suffers a mechanical anomaly or last minute you decide you want to spend the new year in Mexico, you're covered because the single entry permit is good for 180 days. The multiple entry permit will expire at midnight of December 31st. Regardless of which permit you get, they are only legal if they are accompanied by the official receipt for the money that was paid to purchase the permit. Airports in Mexico fall into one of four categories. It may be federally owned and federally operated. It may be federally owned but operated by a private company under a concession. It may be state-owned and state-operated, or it could be privately owned and operated. The type of ownership and operation can affect the fees that are charged at that airport. Some fees in Mexico are independent of the aircraft. There are fixed fees, such as your entry permit fee, passenger fees, things like that. Other fees are based on the maximum takeoff weight of the aircraft, such as your landing fee, your ramp fee, and your overnight parking fee. Some FBOs in Mexico provide fabulous service at very reasonable prices. Then there are some that don't. So before you commit yourself to an FBO at an airport, be sure that you request a quote in writing before you land so that you know exactly what to expect and what it's going to cost. Flying with Mexico can be an incredibly amazing and gratifying experience. Before departing an airport for another airport in Mexico, you need to make sure that you have paid any fees that are owed. For flying under IFR or VFR within Mexico, you will be asked to complete an ICAO flight plan form, and it will be on paper. You cannot use electronic apps for flights within Mexico. Depending on the airport in Mexico, VFR flights may not be allowed to specify airways in their route, but you can always put from VOR to direct to another VOR. Once you've completed your flight plan form, you'll need to go to the Civil Aviation office to have your form stamped. They may request to see your entry permit, the single or multiple entry permit. Once you have departed and you land at the next airport, they will all typically have a ramp for General Aviation aircraft, and that's where you should taxi to or request, if it's Tower Airport, authorization and a clearance to taxi to the General Aviation ramp. Don't be surprised if you're met once again by military staff. The form that I mentioned earlier that you can download from the CST member website is a very useful tool to translate the most commonly asked questions. As with all good things in life, everything unfortunately has to come to an end, and visiting Mexico is one of those things. So now when it comes time to go, you need to remember that for flights from Mexico to a foreign country, including the US, must depart Mexico through an AOE. You must also submit your Mexican APIS within the time frame specified. If you had a single entry permit, you must surrender it to the authorities. If you have a multiple entry permit, don't lose it. File it away along with the receipt that came with it for payment. You must return your immigration form if you were given one when you entered the country. And you may be asked to complete a general declaration form. If you are flying to a country other than the US, we strongly recommend that you complete it even if you are not asked, and make sure it is stamped by Mexican immigration and by Mexican customs, because when you fly to the next country, you may very well be asked to present it to demonstrate where you came from. On departure, you may once again be asked to complete a cash declaration form, and you will need to pay a Mexican immigration departure fee from the airport and any other airport fees and FBO fees that may be applied. Once done, you'll need to present your ICAO flight plan form, and remember that when you depart a Mexican towered airport, both your IFR flight plan or your VFR flight plan will be automatically activated by the tower. However, when traveling to the US, check our US procedures video for more specific information on what to do for flights from Mexico to the US. You can find useful country-specific information, including forms, airports of entry, fuel prices, and much more on the CST member website. Without getting into the details, just remember, avoid at all costs making an international landing at the Chihuahua Airport, Mike, Charlie uniform. Make your international arrival somewhere else and then fly there domestically if your intent is to fly to Chihuahua. The following are some tips that you may find useful for flying to Mexico. When communicating with air traffic control, use your full tail number. Don't use phrases like Skylane 123 Alpha Charlie or Bonanza 123 Alpha Charlie. You are November 123 Alpha Charlie. There is no night VFR in Mexico. The official common traffic advisory frequency in Mexico is 122.5. However, as you get closer to the US-Mexico border, you may find more usage of 122.8. If you have any doubts, what we do is we transmit in the blind on both until we get an answer on one of them. All airports in Mexico require a valid operating permit to be legally used. If you're planning to fly to a remote airport, make sure that it has a valid permit. Operating at airports without a valid permit is not allowed, and in the event of an incident, it could also give your insurance company a very good reason to deny coverage. Left-hand traffic patterns in Mexico prevail, and if you're flying an aircraft capable of more than 200 knots, take note that Mexico has different regulation with regards to speed restrictions. If you are unsure of what ATC has instructed you to do, always clarify. Never assume. As Mexico is typically a non-radar environment, expect to give position reports in radial and DME. DME arcs are alive and well in Mexico and are commonly used in instrument flying procedures. Without getting into technical details, avoid accepting a GPS approach in Mexico. Mexican air traffic radar does not have weather capability as we do in the US. So do not expect them to either see nor to steer you away from weather. Things can change rapidly in the international aviation environment, and Mexico is no exception. Always be checking and double checking notices to air missions. Some airports in Mexico can impose restriction on landing and parking during the peak season, so always check in advance of your flight. If you're uneasy and apprehensive about making a border crossing flight under VFR, if you are authorized and capable, consider making it under IFR. Communications can sometimes be a challenge in certain parts of Mexico, so try flying higher or ask other aircraft to help relay information. Always, always, always clarify any doubts. Never assume. At non-towered airports, always check the runway surface before committing yourself to land. Mexico is metric, so be prepared to convert. At certain times of the year in certain parts of Mexico, the temperature can become very high, which can pose a challenge to certain viscosity oils. Always have a plan on how you're going to handle your personal items that you want to bring into Mexico if you are a pilot. At some airports in Mexico, Mexican immigration may incorrectly charge you an additional fee. And if we didn't get the message across to you earlier, if you are entering Mexico from anywhere other than the US or Canada, you must make your first landing in either Tapachula or Cozumel. For more information and resources for planning and executing an international flight, the CST member website contains a wealth of information amassed over years of experience and kept up to date with the latest information. This concludes our video for planning a trip to Mexico. We hope you found this information useful. Take advantage of the other videos as well as the information that's contained in the CST member website.